I was already in my pajamas and about to throw back the covers to finally fall into that long-awaited sleep that had been looming on the horizon all day, but stubbornly eluding me, when my phone vibrated on the nightstand, illuminating the dim bedroom with its cold screen. My little sister's name flashed on the screen, Sarah. And damn, I almost decided to keep quiet because the clock showed almost 11, and I had to get up for work at 7 tomorrow, and I knew myself. If I got caught up in the conversation now, I wouldn't be able to fall back to sleep. But I knew her too. She would call again and again until I gave in and picked up, so I really had no choice. "Hi, Sarah. Who's Michelle?" I muttered, pressing the green button, about to say we'd discuss everything tomorrow. "Oh my God, I'm so glad you answered." Her voice exploded over the speaker with such energy, as if she had a drum motor in her chest instead of a heart. "I have the most amazing news in the world." I sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling fatigue sluggish my movements, my thoughts tangled. But curiosity was already rearing its head. "Sarah, it's really late and I have to work tomorrow," I sighed. "Can we talk about this tomorrow?" "No, no, no," she interrupted me so abruptly that I almost pulled the phone away from my ear. "You need to hear this right now. It will change everything for our family." She rattled on so quickly that I caught every second word and felt irritation slowly creeping into my skin. I'd been working on this business idea for weeks now, and I finally thought through all the details. "We're all going to be rich, Michelle. Seriously rich." I rubbed my temples and closed my eyes. At 34, I'd already learned to be wary of any grandiose promises of riches, especially when they came from family members who had a habit of grabbing everything that glitters and falling to the bottom with a loud splash. "Sarah, slow down. What exactly do you mean?" Okay. Look, everyone's complaining about how expensive everything is these days. Well, I figured out a way to solve that and make a ton of money at the same time. This is brilliant." I heard her footsteps. The familiar creaking of the floorboards told me she was pacing back and forth in my apartment, the very one where I'd let her and her husband live rent-free for the past 3 years, blaming it on their difficulty getting up. Whether she was wearing heels or barefoot, it always revealed the same thing, a nervous energy she never had enough to complete any task. "I'm going to launch a subscription service," she spoke even faster, "where people pay a monthly fee and get discounted products delivered right to their door. But here's the genius part. I'll partner with local businesses and everyone wins." I paused, trying to process her words. In 10 years working for a large consulting firm, I'd seen dozens of similar ideas. Beautiful on paper, but dead in the water within the first year. "Sarah, this sounds like all the other subscription services," I said quietly but firmly. "The market is saturated with them." "No, mine will be different," she interrupted again, as always, not really listening. "I'll focus on local businesses, not corporations. People want to support their own." I could already see holes the size of canyons in her plan. The logistics were a nightmare. Managing a bunch of small stores at once, inventory management, customer complaints, endless frustrations, and all this, assuming she could even convince enough small shop owners to get involved. "Okay," I sighed, barely managing to maintain my patience. "But why are you calling me at 11 o'clock at night about this?" There was a pause on the other end, and all I could hear was her breathing, as if she were about to dive into icy water and gathering her strength. "The thing is," she finally said, "I need a little startup capital to get this all off the ground." My heart sank. Small in her mind always meant catastrophically huge in reality. "How much?" I asked, already clenching my teeth. "Just $100,000, she said, as easily as if she were talking about buying a new pair of boots. I choked on my own spit and coughed, so I had to pull the phone away from my face. "What did you just say?" I breathed out, standing up and pacing the bedroom nervously, as if the walls were closing in. $100,000, she repeated calmly. "I know it may seem like a lot, but think of it as an investment. You'll get it all back, with interest, when the business takes off." I paced the room, barely keeping my voice level, even though inside I was seething like an old kettle forgotten on the stove. "Sarah, why should I give you $100,000 for a business that, frankly, has no more than a 5% chance of success?" I asked, and I could hear the steel in my voice that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. "Because you're rich," she snapped, and then irritation crept into her tone, the same irritation that usually appeared when she realized I wasn't going to play into her fantasies. "You have a house. You have an apartment. You make a good living at your job. For you, 100,000 is nothing." I froze in place and felt a wave of anger run through me, because this was untrue and worse, unfair. Yes, I was financially secure, but only because I took every single fucking step toward that state myself, without anyone's help, without any gifts from fate, without anyone handing me a ready-made check. I worked myself to the bone, saved every penny, invested wisely, endured years when work was all I needed for a vacation, and now she's telling me that's nothing to me? $100,000 isn't small change, even for me, and certainly not for some whimsical project whose failure I could see coming a mile away. "Sarah, listen to me," I said slowly, trying not to break down. "I've been working in business development for over 10 years. I've seen hundreds of business plans, and I can tell you right now, yours won't work. You'll be lucky if you can last at least 6 months before you run out of money." There was such silence on the other end that for a second I thought the connection had been cut off. But then, through that pause, her husband's muffled voice drifted in, clearly asking what had happened. Sarah said something briefly to him and then returned to me, her voice trembling with resentment. "You know what, Michelle? I thought you'd support me. I truly believed you'd want to help your family succeed." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I'm trying to help, Sarah," I almost shouted. "I'm helping you by saving you from making a terrible mistake. If you want to gain experience in business, start small. Use your own money or your mom and dad's if they're willing to invest in your dream. But don't ask me for 100,000 like it's nothing." She paused for a second, then said coldly, "Fine. As you wish. Apparently, I was wrong about you." Before I could respond, there was a short buzz. She simply hung up. No talk later, no good night, just a sudden pause, like a door slamming. I sat for a minute staring at the phone, shaking my head, feeling fatigue and irritation wash over me in one heavy wave. I knew Sarah had always been prone to drama, but even for her, this was too much. Plugging my phone into charge, I finally lay down, deciding that was it, and that in a day or two she'd cool down, calm down, and everything would return to normal. Maybe later she'd even thank me for not letting her waste both my money and her life in this madness. The next morning I woke up with a strange feeling of lightness. I made myself a strong coffee, opened my laptop, started sorting through my emails, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the day could be peaceful. And just then, my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen, and my heart skipped a beat. It was my mom. This was unusual because she almost never called me in the morning, usually preferring to call closer to noon or in the evening. "Hi, Mom," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "How are you?" "Michelle." Her voice was low and stern, and immediately my stomach tightened. It was the same tone she used to speak to me as a child when I was in trouble. "I need to talk to you right now." My heartbeat immediately spiked. "What's wrong?" I asked cautiously. "The problem is," she said heavily, "your sister called me last night in tears because you refused to help her with some small request." "Small request?" I almost spat out the coffee I'd just made. "Mom, she asked me for $100,000. "That's not much," Mom countered calmly. "For someone in your position, 100,000 is nothing. You own 2 properties. You have a good job, a stable income. Sarah just wants to get ahead, become better, and support her family." I couldn't believe my ears. I stared at the kitchen wall, unblinking, and felt anger and despair rising within me. "Mom, do you even know what her brilliant business idea is? It's a subscription service in an oversaturated market where 90% of companies fail within the first year. It's a surefire failure. Basically, I just throw the money in the trash. What if it doesn't work out?" My mother's voice became sharp like a blow to my nerves, and I heard in it that old harshness that used to make my knees tremble as a child when I came home with a bad grade. "At least," she said, Sarah would gain invaluable entrepreneurial experience. And isn't that worth supporting her sister? I sank into my chair as if I'd been cut off and croaked into the phone. Are you seriously asking me to shell out $100,000 just so she can see firsthand how painful it is to fall flat on her face? But my mother, as if she hadn't heard, continued in a cold, tired voice. I'm asking you to support your family, not greedily cling to your money like some kind of selfish person. And then I felt anger boiling up inside me, so thick and viscous that my breathing became labored. Selfish, I hissed. Mom, I work 60 hours a week to earn this money. I don't find it under a fence or pick it from a tree. I bend over backwards to provide for myself, and now I'm supposed to just give Sarah $100,000 so she can play around with business. If she wants experience, let her start small. Let her risk her own money, or yours and Dad's, if you're so eager to invest in her dream. There was a silence on the other end, long and thick, like the pause before a verdict. And then Mom said something that cut me like a knife. Do you know what your problem is, Michelle? You don't understand what family is. Real families are supposed to help each other, not make excuses. I froze, and the words stuck in my throat because I felt like I'd fallen into some kind of nightmare. Me? I don't understand what family is? I, the one who let Sarah and her husband live in my apartment rent-free for 3 years because they were always broke? I, the one who bailed my parents out of debt when they had roof repair bills? I, the one who paid for Sarah's wedding, took the whole family on vacation, covered Mom's medical expenses when she had back problems? And now they call me selfish just because I don't want to burn $100,000 in the bonfire of her fantasies? Mom, my voice broke, but I didn't try to hide it. I've been helping you my whole life. My whole damn life. But if Sarah wants to start a business, she needs to do what grown-ups do at least once. Write a real business plan, do some research, make some forecasts, and not just call in the middle of the night demanding money and say, "Trust me." A heavy sigh came from the other end of the line, and her voice suddenly turned icy, clipped, like ice on asphalt. I can't believe you've become so cold, Michelle. Your father and I raised you better than that. I laughed bitterly and quietly, almost soundlessly. You raised me to work hard, to count my money and be responsible for it, and that's exactly what I'm doing now, Mom. But Mom wasn't listening anymore. We'll see, she muttered, and her voice was alien. Maybe one day you'll understand what you lost when you turned away from your family. The receiver clicked, a short dial tone rang, and everything went silent. I sat motionless, staring at the phone, feeling as if the world had turned inside out. Just yesterday I'd been a daughter and sister, and now I seemed to have found myself in another universe, where my family stood before me like judges. The next weeks passed in a strange silence. I kept waiting for Sarah to show up, to call and say something, maybe apologize, maybe explain, because she always called at least twice a week, unable to live without poking her nose into my life. But now the phone was silent, and this silence became increasingly heavy. Weeks stretched into months, and I gradually settled into a new routine. Work progressed, projects bore fruit, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, as if all the family drama had been left behind closed doors. But time passed, and as autumn gave way to winter, I realized Christmas was approaching, and habit proved stronger than resentment. I began rushing around the shops in advance, choosing expensive gifts because it was my strange loyalty to my family, even if they didn't deserve it. I bought a soft cashmere scarf for my mother, a bottle of good whiskey for my father, and new kitchen gadgets for Sarah and her husband, so they could once again tell their friends that everything in the house comes from my generous sister. I always chose my gifts with heart, even though I knew the answer would be a cheap trinket bought on the run. 3 months had passed since that late-night conversation, and I believed everything would settle down by Christmas, because family squabbles in our house never lingered over the holidays. But exactly a week before Christmas, the phone rang again, and Mom's name was on the screen. I picked it up with a sigh of relief and said, "Yes, Mom," and heard her cold, dry voice. "Michelle, I need to tell you something about Christmas." I smiled and, trying to smooth things over, replied, "Okay, Mom, what time do you want me to come?" I've already prepared the gifts, but her voice turned hard as stone. "Exactly. You're not invited this year." And I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach with all their might, knocking the air out of my chest and making my heart freeze. "What do you mean I wasn't invited?" My voice wavered, though I tried to sound firm, but everything inside me collapsed, as if I'd been dragged out of the house into the cold barefoot. Mom sighed heavily, and there was no hesitation in her voice anymore. "Sarah doesn't want you there. She said she can't even look at you after what you did. She demanded that we not invite you, and your father and I agreed." I choked on air because I couldn't even imagine such a turn of events in my worst nightmares. "Are you kidding, Mom? Are you really choosing Sarah over me?" "We're not choosing anyone." Her voice was even, like a judge reading the verdict. "You chose to hurt your sister when she needed support most. All of this is simply a consequence of your actions. When you spend Christmas alone, maybe you'll finally understand what family means." Click. The line went dead, and I was left in complete silence, holding the phone like a piece of ice burning my palm. My insides clenched so tightly I felt like I couldn't breathe. They were really going to cut me out of the party, out of my own family, out of my home, just because I refused to flush $100,000 down the drain for Sarah's crazy scheme. I immediately started calling her, my fingers trembling, the screen blurry. 1 ring, 2, 3, all voicemail. I left 3 messages, calm at first, then increasingly heartbroken, but there was no answer. Finally, I decided, screw it. I'll go straight to her apartment, the same one where she and Tom lived, my apartment, the one they hadn't paid a cent for in years, and look her in the eyes. I pounded on the door so hard my knuckles turned white. "Sarah, it's me. We need to talk." Her voice, cold and harsh, rang out through the wood. "Go away, Michelle. I don't want to see you." "Sarah, please open the door," I almost begged, pressing my forehead against the frame. "Let's at least talk. We'll sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out," she snapped. "You made your choice when you refused to help me. I don't consider you my sister anymore." These words hit harder than any slap. I recoiled, feeling my legs buckle. "Sarah, are you crazy?" I screamed, pounding on the door again. "Open up! This is ridiculous." "No," she replied shortly. "Leave me alone and don't come back." I stood there for another 10 minutes like an idiot, knocking, pleading, getting angry, then pleading again. But it didn't budge. The lock didn't click. The wood of the door didn't budge. Finally, I realized I was talking to myself and walked to the car, my head spinning with anger and frustration. At home, I immediately poured myself a huge glass of red wine, sat in the living room, and stared at the Christmas tree. Neatly wrapped presents lay beneath it, and they seemed to mock me. A cashmere scarf for my mother, who had just cut me out of the holiday, a set of expensive kitchen gadgets for my sister, who hadn't even opened the door to hear me out, whiskey for my father, who had remained silent and agreed with my mother's decision. I sat and stared at this pile of sparkling paper and ribbons, and it seemed as if none of them were gifts, but mockery of my naivety. And then memories came rushing through my head, one after another, like slaps in the face. For 3 years, I let Sarah and Tom live in my apartment rent-free. $2,000 a month, minimum, maybe more. I'd probably given them over $70,000 over those years just on rent. And that's not even counting everything else. I paid for Sarah's entire wedding because they were broke and could barely scrape together enough money for the rings. 2 years ago, I took the whole family to Hawaii. Everything was on me, from the flights to the hotel, and everyone smiled, took pictures, raised glasses, and said how generous I was. I paid for Mom's dental work when she needed expensive treatment, without which she couldn't even eat properly. I helped Dad when his car broke down and he couldn't afford the repairs. I remembered these things one by one, and with each image, my rage grew. This is how they repaid me. They conspired behind my back and cut me out of the family, as if I were a stranger, just because I didn't want to throw away more money on Sarah's latest scheme. At first, I just felt pain, like a hot iron hand was squeezing my chest. But then the pain gave way to anger, so pure and searing that I stood up and finished my wine in one gulp. How dare they do this to me after everything I'd done? How dare Sarah even pretend to be a victim when she'd lived off me for years, in my apartment, on my money, under my protection? I poured myself another glass, looked at these gifts, and finally said out loud to myself, enough. If they've decided to cut me out, fine. But I'm no longer their ATM, their lifeline, their cash cow. If I'm trash to them, then let them look for money elsewhere. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, but a clear thought was already pounding in my head. Enough of being comfortable. I got ready and drove to the mall, and in the trunk lay neatly folded bags, each with beautiful packaging that only yesterday I'd seen as a symbol of my love for my family. Now they were just things I was dragging to the returns counter, and the faces of the salespeople who exchanged glances as I laid out bag after bag were filled with quiet surprise and incomprehension. But I didn't care. Let them think I was crazy. Let them whisper that I was one of those women who buy gifts beyond measure and then return them all because their husband left or they suddenly ran out of money. I stood up straight, looked them in the eye, and shamelessly accepted every bill back. In the end, I had almost $800 in my account, money that I chose to save rather than throw away on people who had taken everything from me for years without even saying a proper thank you. As I stepped outside and breathed in the cold air, a plan was already forming inside me, so clear and bold that my fingers were shaking. I decided I needed to wait until Christmas to put it into action. And this plan, unlike my sister's wild schemes, was realistic, well thought out, and logical down to the last detail. The next few days passed in a kind of daze. I turned off my phone because I didn't want to risk hearing their voices and losing my temper at a weak moment. And of course, no one called, not even the usual text asking how I was doing or if I'd changed my mind. Complete silence, emptiness, as if I truly no longer existed for them. Finally, Christmas Eve arrived. I spent it at home, without fuss, without running around the shops and cooking until I dropped. I ordered Chinese takeout, lay down on the couch, and watched Netflix, and it felt strange. Not rushing between the kitchen and the living room, not pretending everything was perfect while anger ate away inside and fake birthday greetings echoed around me. It was unusual, but at the same time, calm, almost peaceful. No stress, no drama, no pretending to be the perfect daughter and sister. On Christmas morning, I woke up late, around 10, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself the luxury of sleeping without an alarm clock. I made myself breakfast, avocado toast and eggs, made strong coffee, and leaning back in my chair, opened Sarah's social media. Sure enough, there were photos already there. The timestamp showed they were taken just half an hour earlier. In them, my whole family was sitting in my parents' living room with mugs of coffee and presents on their laps, everyone with such contented smiles as if life was good. But what struck me most was the caption, "Spend Christmas morning with the people who truly matter." Sometimes you have to cut toxic people out of your life to make room for happiness. I read those words over and over again, my insides seething. Toxic people? Me? Because I refused to throw $100,000 at her stupid dream? Her audacity took my breath away, my heart pounding like a cornered animal. But at the same time, her post confirmed what I needed. She and Tom were definitely at their parents' house and planning to spend the day there, which meant my apartment, my own apartment where they lived like they owned it, was currently empty. I grabbed my keys and drove there. The car sped down the street, and I felt a cold determination growing within me with each passing minute. Of course, I still had a spare key, since the place was officially mine, and I had every right to it. As I walked in and looked around, my insides clenched with rage. My beautiful apartment had become a pigsty. A mountain of dirty dishes clung to the sink. Clothes lay scattered on the chairs and floor. The carpet looked like it hadn't been vacuumed in months, and the air was thick with a mixture of cheap beer and old sweat. I started with the bedroom. I methodically gathered up every item, every little thing, and stuffed it into boxes and suitcases. Clothes, books, cosmetics, their cheap electronics, everything that belonged to them. At first, my hands shook, but then my movements became precise, confident, and with each item boxed, I felt myself freeing myself from their sticky presence. It all took almost 2 hours. Then I called the storage facility whose contact information I'd written down in advance. I was prepared. Luckily, they were open even on Christmas, apparently because people often experience family disasters during the holidays. I paid the rent and drove their junk there 3 times, unloading and slinging boxes and suitcases as if I were lifting sacks of rocks from my shoulders. On my last trip, I dialed the number of the mechanic I'd called in advance. He agreed, without further ado, to come and work on Christmas Day for double pay, and I told him the price was more than acceptable. At that moment, for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. By the time I returned from the warehouse, dusk was already gathering outside, and a frosty blue shrouded the houses, as if hinting at a long and cold Christmas night, but a strange, unfamiliar feeling of lightness lingered in my chest. The mechanic I'd arranged with in advance was already waiting for me outside my house, sitting in his van, twirling a steaming thermos in his hands. We exchanged a quick nod, and he immediately set to work without further ado or questioning, as if he understood everything without words. It took him about 40 minutes to replace both locks, the new deadbolt and the heavy doorknob, and all that time I stood in the hallway, listening to the clanking of his tools, the clinging of metal against metal, and each turn of his screwdriver sounded like a nail in the coffin of my former, comfortable, submissive role. When he finished, he handed me the brand new keys on a shiny ring, wished me Merry Christmas, and drove away without looking back, leaving me alone with my silent triumph. I stood in the apartment, breathing in the air, no longer reeking of someone else's unwashed clothes, cheap beer, and constant chaos. The silence was so thick and even that it felt as if the apartment itself had exhaled along with me. For the first time in years, I felt like the space was mine again. Clean, calm, protected. I closed the door, checked the new lock, smiled, and went home to treat myself to a real treat. I ordered dinner at my favorite Italian restaurant, the one where the pasta is always al dente, the sauces are thick and spicy, and even the delivery feels like a small celebration. I opened the bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion, and finally realized that this moment, when I chose myself for the first time in my life, was exactly that occasion. I turned on some music, let the soft jazz chords fill the room, and called a few friends, those who never called me toxic, those who weren't there for the money, but because they valued me for who I was. None of them were related to me, but their voices held more warmth and respect than I'd ever heard from my own family. Sitting in my living room with a glass of champagne and a plate of hot pasta, I suddenly realized this was the best Christmas I'd had in years. No drama, no feeling like I had to pretend to be grateful for a cheap, last-minute trinket, while I spent thousands so others could have the perfect Christmas. Just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of having stood up for myself for the first time in my life and cut the rotten rope that was dragging me down. I watched a couple of good movies, laughing and even crying, but my tears were from relief, not pain. Then I video called a college friend who had long since moved to California, and we talked for hours, reminiscing about our college silly days and dreaming of meeting up. When I went to bed, I felt a sense of lightness in my soul that I hadn't felt in months, maybe even years. The next morning, I woke up late, brewed myself a strong coffee, and sipping it from my favorite mug, began clearing out the cabinets and shelves, putting aside everything unnecessary, as if I were continuing to purge not only the apartment, but myself as well. It was already close to noon when the phone on the table vibrated. First, Sarah's name flashed on the screen, then Tom's, followed immediately by Mom's, then Dad's. The calls came one after another, as if they were conspiring in a panic. I knew that right now they'd discovered empty rooms, neatly stacked boxes in the warehouse, and new locks that had cut them off from my life once and for all. I smiled and silenced the phone. Let them figure out what had happened. Let them drown in their own anger and bewilderment. For me, there was no longer any possibility of returning to that role where I was endlessly indebted, endlessly guilty, endlessly saving. I would no longer be their eternal wallet and shoulder to cry on while I remained crushed. This was only the beginning. The calls continued for over 2 hours. I watched their anger grow with each missed call, and the voicemails, initially polite and full of false regret, quickly devolved into hoarse shouts, accusations, and threats. By midnight, everything had quieted down, and I was almost asleep when, at 2 a.m, my doorbell rang. I looked out the window and saw all 4 of them. My family stood on my porch like an angry mob at the gate. My mother clutched her purse so tightly as if she wanted to use it as a weapon. My father crossed his arms over his chest and stared at the door with a heavy, dark gaze. Sarah was seething with rage, her face crimson, like a child deprived of a toy. Tom looked lost, confused, as if he'd been hoping until the very last moment for a different outcome. I took a deep breath and opened the door. They burst in without even bothering to ask permission, and immediately filled my living room, crushing the fragile peace I'd so carefully created with their presence. "What the hell did you do?" Sarah screamed, her voice shaking with rage, her lips trembling so hard she felt like they were about to split. "The locks are changed. You can't just throw us out like this." "Actually, I can," I answered calmly, in an icy tone that surprised even me. "This is my apartment." Mom stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears, her voice soft and pleading. "Michelle, darling, there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. We didn't mean to hurt you this Christmas. We just wanted to give Sarah time to cool off." "Misunderstanding?" I looked straight at her, not believing a word. "You said it yourself that I'm toxic. You said I'd only understand the meaning of family when I spent Christmas alone. You know, Mom, it didn't seem like a misunderstanding to me at all." Dad finally spoke up, his hoarse, weary tone cutting through the air as if he himself was tired of this carnage. But he decided to intervene anyway. "Look, maybe we all said too much. Maybe we didn't mean it. But Michelle, throwing your sister out on the street isn't going to work. Where are they supposed to live?" And at that moment, I felt the anger that had been building up for years boiling inside me, like hot tar under my skin, because he was once again speaking as if I alone were responsible for their lives, as if I were some kind of bank, not a daughter and sister. "That's not my problem anymore," I said coldly, as if cutting the invisible rope they'd grown accustomed to draping around my neck. "You yourself made it clear last week that I'm nothing to you, that I'm not part of your family. So explain why strangers have to live in my apartment." I looked straight at Sarah, and her jaw dropped, her eyes widening. "Strangers?" she screamed, her voice breaking, trembling with anger. "We're not strangers, you crazy person. We're your family." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice from shaking, and answered slowly, making sure each word cut like glass. "No, Sarah, that's not true. The family isn't banishing you from Christmas just because you don't want to flush $100,000 down the toilet. The family isn't calling you toxic for being responsible for your own money. The family is at least trying to communicate instead of hanging up on you and blacklisting you." At this point, Tom finally interjected, his voice strained as if he'd been rehearsing this for a long time. "Michelle, we've been living there for 3 years. We can't just find a new place overnight. Can't we think of something else?" I turned sharply to him, a new wave of anger boiling in my chest. "You should have thought of that, Tom, before you decided to punish me for not funding your wife's latest stupidity. Did you really think I'd just sign a check for $100,000? For what? For her latest failure?" Sarah immediately exploded, flushed and shaking. "It's not a failure. Nothing's been proven yet. You know nothing. You always look down on me like I'm nobody." I almost laughed in her face, but instead I said dryly, almost contemptuously, "Sarah, you've never run a business in your life. You haven't even had a job that lasted more than a couple of years. You have no plan, no market research, no financial forecasts, not the slightest understanding of how those subscription services you rave about work, but you expect me to give you $100,000 just because you suddenly feel like an entrepreneur? Are you serious? She squealed like a wounded animal. You have a family to support. And that's when I lost it. Support a family? I screamed, my temples ringing. I've been supporting you all for ages. I let you live in my apartment for 3 years, and that, by the way, is over $70,000, which you didn't even bother to count. I paid for your entire wedding, Sarah, because you and Tom were broke. I dragged you all to Hawaii, paid for Mom's medical bills, Dad's car repairs, and God knows what else. And this is how you repay me. You kicked me out of the family because I didn't want to spend another $100,000 on your fantasy. Mom was already sobbing, wiping her tears with the corner of her handkerchief. We didn't know you were counting all this. I wasn't counting, Mom, I replied, more quietly, but my voice trembled with rage. I helped because I thought that's how a family should behave. But apparently I was wrong, because none of this means anything to you if I'm not willing to spend another $100,000 on Sarah's dream. This is not a dream, Sarah screamed, stamping her foot like a petulant child. Yes, exactly, I interrupted her. And you know what that proves? That you can't even think 2 steps ahead. You decided to punish me, to cut me out of the party, to make me feel like an outcast, and in response, I simply up and took my apartment back. That's exactly why you'll never succeed in business, because you can't calculate the consequences. Sarah stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Tom, turning pale, finally asked quietly, "Where's our stuff?" I silently walked to the table, picked up a piece of paper, and wrote down the address from the warehouse. I walked up to him and thrust the paper into his hand. Everything's in there. I paid for a month's storage. From now on, you figure it out. You can't do this to us, Sarah screamed, real tears now streaming down her cheeks. I've already been accepted, I said calmly. She choked on her sobs. We're used to living there. We don't have the money for rent. I looked at her coldly and clearly so that every word would be etched into her memory. Then maybe it's time to finally get a job and start acting like adults instead of living off your sister. Dad stepped forward, his face tense, his lips pursed, and his voice rang with that steely note I remembered from childhood, when he tried to reason with Sarah and me after yet another fight over toys. Michelle, this has gone too far. You're cruel, he said. And those words made something inside me snap, as if I was once again being made to blame for all the family's sins. I slowly turned to him and stared straight into his eyes, feeling my chest swell with bitterness and weariness. Am I cruel? I repeated, my voice breaking into laughter, but it was a bitter, angry laugh. I'm the one who kept your ass afloat for years while you pretended everything was fine. I toiled at a back-breaking job, pulled you out of debt, paid bills that weren't even mine. And for this, you rewarded me with what? You cut me out of Christmas for making the mature and responsible decision not to throw $100,000 into the void. My own sister called me toxic, and now I'm cruel. Are you serious? A silence fell over the room, so thick you could hear the radiators clicking in the corner. Mom sat there, sniffling silently, her shoulders shaking slightly, as if every word I said struck her like a whip. Sarah wiped her snot with her sleeve, looking less angry and more broken, but I knew it wasn't remorse. It was self-pity. Dad looked confused, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just said. Listen. Mom finally spoke up, her voice quiet, almost pleading. Maybe we should all just sit down and talk, like adults. We'll figure something out, some way out. No, I said firmly, so firmly that even I felt a chill run through me. There's nothing to decide. You made your choice when you decided I was no longer part of the family. Now I'm making mine. I'm done with you. That's not what you meant, Dad said quietly, as if grasping at straws. I'm absolutely serious, I said, looking straight at him. From now on, I don't want any calls, texts, or unexpected visits. No financial support. It's over. You're on your own now. Michelle, please, Mom sobbed, and for the first time I heard genuine pleading in her voice, not the usual manipulation. "We're sorry. We were wrong." "Yes, you were wrong," I nodded, "and now you'll have to live with the consequences." I walked to the front door and threw it wide open. Cold air rushed into the room, washing over us with a crisp chill. "I want you all to leave my house, now, and never come back." They froze for a moment, exchanging glances, as if they couldn't believe I was actually doing this. Dad stood up first, silently taking Mom's hand and leading her toward the door. Tom trudged after him, his shoulders slumped, like a man whose last hope had just been snatched away. Sarah stopped right in front of me, her eyes blazing with hatred, her lips trembling. "I hate you," she whispered, her voice ringing with emptiness. "Okay," I replied calmly. "Now there are two of us." When the door slammed behind them, I turned the key in the lock and leaned my forehead against the cold wood. I was shaking like I'd been in a fight, and my chest felt empty, but at the same time I felt a strange relief, as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted. It was over. The following weeks tested my patience. The phone was ringing off the hook. Mom was either playing the blame game, sobbing into the phone, whispering that her heart wouldn't take it if I didn't answer. Dad wrote long messages, trying to be reasonable, offering compromises, suggesting we discuss everything calmly. Sarah veered between apologies and threats. One moment she swore she understood and wanted to make peace. The next she promised to curse me if I didn't return her house. Tom, as always, whined about money, complaining that the rent was draining all their energy. I ignored it all. Over time, the calls became less frequent, then almost disappeared. From mutual friends, I learned that Sarah and Tom had found a tiny apartment on the other side of town. We're barely making ends meet, but we're holding on. Mom and Dad, of course, told everyone what a heartless, selfish person I was, only forgot to mention that they'd kicked me out of the Christmas party for a credit scam. So be it. I'm used to being the villain in other people's stories. Meanwhile, I rented out my apartment to a nice young couple who pay on time and even bring flowers to the neighbors. I was finally earning good rent and living peacefully without constant fights, demands, and drama. Do I miss them? Sometimes. But when I remember how they treated me, that feeling immediately dissipates like smoke. Maybe one day we'll make up, but definitely not anytime soon. This wound is too deep, and I'm not ready to heal it yet. Now I'm happy, truly happy, without their constant chaos, without their endless expectations and demands. Some might call it selfishness, but I call it a simple and honest word: self-preservation.